there was something that came out when they wanted to standardize the education levels of medical doctors, because back in the 1800s, there was no standardization, right? So people would do an apprenticeship under somebody for a few months, and then they would be a doctor of medicine or a doctor of this, right? And so they're like, well, we can't have, from a medicine standpoint, we can't have this. We have to be able to standardize this process. And so there's something developed called FORT. It was by a gentleman, last name Flexner. I can't remember his first name off the top of my head, but he said that this is the minimum criteria that we have to be able to meet to be a medical doctor, medical standards, to look into this type of health. And so with that became an explosion of research, specifically looking at helping individual conditions, because a part of the area is that things had to be significant amount of evidence based around it.
Welcome to the Global Affair podcast, brought to you by Love Out Loud, the world's largest love-based movement, actualizing a civilization of love by 2030. My name's Nicole Gibson, and join me and some of the world's brightest minds as we bring some of the most important and controversial conversations of our time into a space of unity. It's important to know that as your host, this isn't about my personal opinion or bias, but rather an opportunity to listen with love, honesty, curiosity, and reveal the true universal experience us humans have amongst the differences. So if you love the show, please let us know by giving us a rating and tell us how to make this conversation easier for other people to jump into as well. And with that, let's get it. Greg Elliott, welcome to the Global Affair.
I'm very excited for this conversation. Well, it's always great to talk about HRV, but it's also great to talk about HRV from different perspectives. So I'm super excited.
Yeah, me too. I mean, we've been doing some work together lately, and part of the reason I'm excited and passionate to share with our listeners and our community, Greg's actually been doing an experiment with me to see if we can get my HRV with a goal of 80% consistently, daily, and then actually evaluate and assess the impact that has on my cognitive, emotional, and physical functionality, which I've really been enjoying the process. I've already learned so much. And one of the things that I've been reflecting on, Greg, as I go through the process is, health is such a wild beast, and so many people have so many different perspectives. And the more you learn about health, the more it seems that no one is in agreement about anything. And I think for that reason, it can be a really difficult thing for people to engage with. And I would love, just from your perspective, to start breaking that down for us. Why is it that there is so much disagreement and ambiguity in the field of health with all of the modern science we have?
Yeah, it's a phenomenal question. And, with my presentations I've been doing lately, I've been asking the audience, what is health? What people understand and how to describe it. With our company, when we employ new people in the interview process, I always ask this question. I'm always very surprised as to the answers that people give. It's never the same one, really. There's not a lot of overlap between this. And I think for majority of, the last, since medicine was first introduced, there's always been a very big separation between body and mind. Between what we do, we treat the body the way that the medical system is now, the way that's been run, this they call the medicine 2.0 aspect of it all, that they treat the body in and of itself, and that's the only thing that really matters. And as you and I are starting to be able to realize in this emerging science of the interconnectedness of the body, mind, spirit, environment, all these things, you cannot separate them, and they got to be seen as one. And we've been taught in silos. Even background being osteopathy, you had treated where manual therapy provides certain interventions from a physical standpoint. That puts me into a very silo where there's not a lot of other explanations or options given to me outside of my knowledge base that I'm being presented with. And I think it's a push in our medical system now where we're starting to be able to integrate with different therapists and different people and understand this complexity of what health is. And so how I describe in my conversations with people is health is about the physical, emotional, social, and spiritual well-being of somebody, not the absence of disease. So we have to look at all these aspects of well-being, and then perhaps we have to figure out, okay, can we look at these individually? Can we look at how they're interconnected? How can we best look at health as one thing and not in these separate silos?
Yeah, I mean, in every other discipline and tradition of health, there's been this consensus, right, that the system is a cohesive system that has to work together. What was it about the shift into Western medicine that made us start to examine the symptoms in silos and not actually look at the entire system of the human being.
With the heavy reliance on, one of the things that really shifted that I feel is this is part of my osteopathy research is the fact that before in the 1800s, I think there was more of the experimentation around a lot of the mind-body connection and be able to things can not be explained perfectly and have this more integrated wellness type of approach. There was something that came out when they wanted to standardize the education levels of medical doctors, because back in the 1800s, there was no standardization, right? So people would do an apprenticeship under somebody for a few months, and then they would be a doctor of medicine or a doctor of this, right? And so they're like, well, we can't have, from a medicine standpoint, we can't have this. We have to be able to standardize this process. And so there's something developed called report. It was by a gentleman, last name Flexner. I can remember his first name off the top of my head, but he said that this is the minimum criteria that we have to be able to meet to be a medical doctor, medical standards, to look into this type of health. And so with that became an explosion of research, specifically looking at helping individual conditions, because a part of the area is that things had to be significant amount of evidence based around it. And with that time, trying to provide some objectivity around, with blood work or with medical scans and different technologies, they shifted into that to be able to prove out what they wanted to be able to do. And a lot of the professions that were claiming to do medicine that were true kind of allopathic medical professions seemed to fall behind in a lot of that standpoint. And so what was being pushed forward was a lot of this out the traditional medicine as we know it now, where it's very much rooted in a lot of evidence kind of going through the stuff with objective markers going forward. And that's the way that kind of healthcare was deemed to be super important. And then it really shifted away from understanding the body's impact of what's going on to a lot of these processes around with the understanding the mind and the complexity of an individual, how all that becomes intertwined to someone's health. It really tried to shift that. What they tried to do is standardize things as much as possible. People couldn't be diagnosed with various emotional disorders, so they had to fit a certain criteria and this and this and that. And they really try to standardize the process to look at what that specific intervention does in the individual. So it really started to shift away these professions at that specific point to these different groups and different categories, because they all had different visions of how they wanted to be able to improve health.
Well, it makes total sense how we've ended up here. And what role has the pharmaceutical industry, and at what point started to infiltrate the direction of how medical system works?
Yeah, and that was the direct result of all this, is the fact that pharmaceuticals around the 60s, 70s, and 80s really started to influx a lot of these people, a lot of these institutions, a lot of these educational processes to show that their medications were working and how they would improve various things. And that was a part of this evolution, as that's when the pharmaceutical companies really started to be able to take off because of these silo type of approaches to show their impact on various conditions when they're able to specifically get after the right demographic, the right type of people. And so that was a part of the catalyst, one of the catalysts around the explosion of the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah. I mean, you've got a country like the United States of America, one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Healthcare is, completely unaffordable for most average American families without health insurance. A trip to the ER just to walk in the door is going to be about $1,700, let alone the treatment that you might need. It's a seriously dire situation. And I think one of the things that you and I share in terms of our passion is to have health be something that the individual can own, that they make theirs, that is personalized to them, that there's not this relationship with the health system where power is being given away or agency over your body is being given away to another person. And I'm curious, because you've worked with, individual high performers through to elite athletes. At what point in your journey of learning about health, working in health, did you really start to realize actually individual agency is a really big part of this equation?
Yeah, it wasn't in school. I'll tell you that much. What we get taught, you always hear this from various professionals, is that when you leave school, you get the feeling that you have the tools to solve any problem, right? Whether that's, physical therapist, whether that's a chiropractor, whether it's a medical doctor, whether it's a clinical psychologist, whether that's a health coach, whatever it may be, you feel like, oh, I got all the tools. I got all these examples of how I can benefit anybody under the sun with my specific thing, and everyone gets better, right? I've seen the data. And then you start to get into the real world and realize that is not true for majority of the cases that you're going to see. It's a small subset. And I think the realization of myself going to, right when I graduated, going to a very high level type of clinic, with clinicians that have been around for a very long period of time, I start to realize when you do various things that, things aren't going the way that you thought they would, and all these different markers. And it's a way more convoluted scenario. And so luckily I had very good mentors around that aspect and started to be able to shadow a lot of different people from different professions, whether it was a health coach, whether it was a psychologist or social worker or medical doctors. And I sat down and I started to realize, they all get people better, right? They all see people with wide ranges of conditions, whether it's, medical conditions, mental health issues, whatever it may be, that they deal with a wide range of things, but everybody gets, people better. And they all have different tools. So I'm like, well, that's interesting. How can this individual have very similar, if not better results as this individual with a completely different set of tools to do the job? And I'm like, okay, well, first off, I may not have all the tools initially. And then you talk about the level of agency is you start to realize is, people really early on when these high level clinicians, one of the big things is I'm saying I'm small subset of your care. I'm very, I'm 1% of what's going to make you better. It's going to be on a lot of the stuff is you're going to be able to change a lot of behavioral alterations and lifestyle modifications that people need to be able to do that. And it's about telling the story of how that's beneficial. Getting to some of the research side of things, you start to look at, genetics. I remember reading this review article about 10 years ago when they started mapping the genome, and a geneticist wrote this paper. And what stuck with me always is the conclusion where she goes, our hope was the fact that genetics would be the missing link for everything, that we can now figure everything out. They are disappointed to realize that it does not play as big a factor as they thought, where our environment significantly shapes who we are. A lot of this is not inherent into them or something that's automatically done within them, but there's a lot of things that individuals can do. And we know now that up to 50% of our health outcomes are driven by our behaviors and our decisions that we make, which is more than our environment, which is more than our genetics, which is more access to care. There's so much more that we can do within our own self. And it's making people understand to show that the fact that you may have this genetic disposition to be, having various forms of cardiovascular disease or cancer or Alzheimer's, but you have so much more control over that condition than you actually realize. So let's work on all those behavioral factors so we can mitigate this response and give you the best chance of living a long, healthy, high quality life.
I feel like through my own journey of health, I've really lived this and experienced this. And hence why I want other people to understand, that so much of our healing can come back into our hands when we make that decision and we start to go on the journey. When I was recovering from an eating disorder, my life very quickly became a series of clinical appointments. And being in that environment and perpetuating the story of sickness, I actually really believed was keeping me sick. It wasn't until I made a decision that irrespective of what the outcome was going to be, I was so fed up with being a part of that system, with the constant referrals and the clinical feel that my life had started to emulate, and break free and get closer to nature, just try to feel good as best I can in the moment. Actually, I started to tap into what I now believe is our innate intelligence, our innate ability to heal. And I'm curious, do you believe that the body has an innate intelligence inside of it to heal? Because I know that's not something that someone working in mainstream medicine is willing to acknowledge a lot of the time.
Yeah, osteopathy, that's a fundamental one of our 4 principles. The body has the innate ability to heal itself, right? And so this is, not necessarily taught in our schools with the way that they are now. Things are shifting, absolutely. But I'm on board with you. There's absolutely an innate ability for us to be able to overcome a lot more than we realize. I think that's a big piece. I think Western medicine now has really taken the control, as you said, the agency away from people to realize I'm at the mercy of this medication. I'm at the mercy of this doctor to decide my health. And that's absolutely not the case. And I know you can rattle off many examples of people that have turned their life around, both, from their body, but mind, as overall health perspective, as have I, where it's the medical system has made them a very vulnerable person. And it's about building that up in individuals. And I have certain tools in my toolbox that can start that process. and getting into my practice a little bit more, you starting to realize of how, so many more areas of individuals to help them along with their own journeys of health. I mean, yeah, to me, it's a foundational principle. And it's one of those things where I always, my wife, sometimes when she has an injury or something that she wants me to be able to treat her, she goes, "Can you fix my knee?" Right. And I never liked that language because it's not my job to fix. My job is to facilitate. Right. And it's your job to go forward with what I'm providing, what your body's providing you to complete and fix, go along with your healing process. I'm 100% on board with you.
And yet people can feel very overwhelmed, right? When you're in a vulnerable situation or you've got an injury or there's, some acute sickness or just something that maybe is off with you, but you're not able to get to the bottom of it. That shift to really being the driver, the captain of your own health journey can feel incredibly overwhelming. Before we jump into a deeper conversation around HRV, do you have a perspective on how someone in that very vulnerable state, can really take the first steps to shift that paradigm for themselves?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously the one is awareness, is the fact of educating around the fact that you do have a significant amount of agency over your health to be able to, go forward. And one of the big shifts that I try to instill in a lot of people that I see is most people come to me with a diagnosis of sorts. It's fibromyalgia. It's a herniated disc. It's some sort of diagnosis, right? And they want how can I remove this label, right? And I think everyone wants a diagnosis, but I think it's one of the worst things that people can have because then they fixate on it and they fit themselves in a specific area, and then it becomes their identity over a period of time. They're not they're not their own person. They're on their own being. They're the fibromyalgia person. They're a person in pain. They're this. And it's about shifting away from the symptoms, shifting away from the diagnosis, of understanding of, okay, well, what has this stopped you from doing, right? You have fibromyalgia, you have pain. What has it stopped you from playing golf? Has it stopped you from playing with your kids? Has it stopped you from doing this? Okay, then that is our focus. Our focus is let's get you back to doing the thing that you want to be able to do, that this quote unquote diagnosis has stopped you from doing. That is a big mentality shift. It's not to the point of I have to shed this diagnosis. It's that I want to get back to a specific task or thing that makes me happy. And let's put that on the forefront. It's never good just to remove a negative. I always try to be able to add a positive, the outlook going forward. What is the goal? What are we trying to be able to achieve? And how can we making sure that we get there? That is our focus. I don't like, again, majority of my people that I see are in pain. And so I just want to be in pain again. And I think we realize that's not going to be possible. We're going to get through emotional pain. We're going to go through physical pain in life. But the difference is that we have to make sure that you have the resilience to overcome it, not let it stop you doing for what you want to be able to do and achieve.
I really love that, moving towards something rather than pushing against something, and the shift that creates, on every level of your life. So why HRV, and when HRV? At what point did you decide to go deep? And maybe even just beginning with an overview of what heart rate variability actually is to a listener that might be unfamiliar.
Yeah, absolutely. What's great is the fact that I think majority of people are starting to understand a little bit from HRV, which is the general public, which is great, even practitioners, clinicians. But heart rate variability is a physiological phenomena that occurs that looking at rest. Is everyone knows 60 beats per minute, 90 beats per minute. We know our heart rate. What's actually significantly more important to understand is actually the frequency of which those beats occur, right? So, and Nicole, you and I can have 60 beats per minute as our resting heart rate, where mine beats like consistent metronome, almost on the second, every single second, at rest, where yours has this nice kind of wavelength as you breathe in, breathe out, this kind of, up and down, nice pattern where it speeds up and it slows down, up to 78, down to 50, up to 70. Both over time, you and I have the same amount of beats that occur per minute. But what research shows is that you are in a healthier, happier state than I am. So we want more variability. And what this translates to is our ability to get into a parasympathetic or rest and digest, a non-stressed state. Our ability to be able to achieve that, which is in our world right now very difficult with everything that's going on with constant stimulation, whether it's with phone or financial worries or world issues, too much coffee in my case usually, but there's too many stimulants that we have. And so we tend to be more in a sympathetic type state, but do we have the ability to actually get into this rest and digest to recover, to be out of this constant threat environment? And that's where heart rate variability looks at, is do we have the ability to get into that? Really quickly, typically it's done multiple ways. One is first thing in the morning. That used to be the way that it's done when I was first measuring heart rate variability. That's the way that it was. You wake up, put a heart rate monitor on, and you take a reading. The more common way now is a nocturnal capture, which is through the night. They take an average over the nighttime. And then there's in the moment measurements where you do, it's right now you breathe and relax and use it as an acute management tool to stress. And so that's the way that it's typically measured. How I got into heart rate variability was during my master's thesis. We were validating various ways to measure heart function non-invasively for clinical populations. And we had different devices that we're testing. I published an article around one specific device that was used for cardiac output. And then during that time, I was introduced to heart rate variability. Now, during exercise, it wasn't very useful. It has limited uses as of right now, but I got first introduced. And when I came back home in 2013 from my master's degree, I started realizing that people were starting to use this measurement a lot more, and there was a lot of talk around it. And so I got in touch early on with a few companies. At the time, there were very few. One was in the UK, one was in Russia, and two were in the US. So at the time, there's only 4 consumer apps that were actually using heart rate variability measurements. And so I started playing around with it myself with my coworkers and friends at the time, and started to understand a little bit more about it all. At the time, it was very heavily marketed as a high performance thing, management of training load. That was how it was marketed with all of the companies that were out. It was all an athletic tool. As I started to utilize it in various populations, and I really started to dive into a lot of the research, I started to realize that it was very heavily rooted into health and well-being. Like one of the early studies we're looking at, obviously, people that had heart events, whether heart attacks, and look at the prognosis of people going forward, is used in the space programs. It's very heavily used in infants in regards to stress within the womb. So there's a lot of research that were not to do with athletes that was rooted in. And how did they make this jump into that? And one of the things you start to look at exercise science in is the fact that you start to realize that when people start to utilize things in health setting, athletes seeing how we can use it in a performance setting and vice versa. And there's a lot of examples to go through that. And so I started to dive into what this actually means, and I started to really understand that it honestly is our ability to adapt and cope with stress in general, our ability to be able to take on all forms of stress and use it in a positive way rather than a negative way. This was no more evident than one of my friends at the time had a really low score one morning. And she goes, "Hey, everything was great. I slept well, I ate well, I feel good. I'm ready to go for today. I feel fine. And what's with the low score?" And I'm like, no idea, right? At the time, I had zero idea. Literally about an hour later, she was so sick that she had to go home, right? So one of the associations and one of the correlations between heart rate variability is the amount of our immune response, our amount of inflammation within the body. It was able to tell her that she was getting sick before she was actually sick and getting symptoms. And I thought, whoa, that to me was like an eye-opening experience of what else can this thing possibly do? Based on that, I was trying to think of, okay, well, what are some symptoms that this could be beneficial for that people would be struggling with? And this is where I started getting to what we call the functional illnesses or the invisible illnesses, right? So this is the chronic pain, chronic fatigue. This is the, people suffering from, PTSD or anxiety or various issues that are purely relied on subjectively. And I started to put this on to a lot of people that suffer from those symptoms. And it's not a diagnostic tool. It doesn't say that you have this condition or you're not, but it provides some sort of objectivity so we can start to rehabilitate people around the subjective marker that our goal is to be able to improve upon it. So it provided a great feedback mechanism as people started to do various supplementations that it was actually beneficial. It's changed sleep pattern, started seeing a different therapist or clinical counselor or whatever it may be. It was a good feedback mechanism for me that the intervention was actually worthwhile, and we actually made long-standing changes for these individuals. And so that's my journey as to where that is now, utilizing in people that are really focused on, health and have some sort of thing where they want some sort of feedback, to making sure that they're doing everything possible to optimize their health and well-being, but also to the point of, is this intervention, is what I'm doing actually worth it?
I mean, we love it because we love the heart and believe in the intelligence of the heart, right? And with all of this compelling insight into what HRV can really illuminate for us, why is it still not really a tool that's used by, your everyday practitioner.
And this works perfectly to how we started this conversation, right? Where to me, what I see this as is that, there's other markers that are phenomenal that are out there, but to me, this is the most important biomarker that we have. And the reason why is because it is truly a whole health biomarker. All areas of health and well-being are impacted by this. If people have poor diets, if they have poor sleep habits, if they exercise too much that is impacting health or too little, if they have low interoception, if they have poor emotional regulation, if they are lacking self-acceptance, if they are not having strong relationships and connection with people, heart rate variability is a reflection of that. So we can be able to see is saying, hey, as we do various things, we can see, hey, this is beneficial, but this is not. The simplicity of it is phenomenal. Is the fact that it's a great overall indicator from a daily, non-invasive perspective. It's very actionable because we can directly affect it. Therein lies the problem, is the fact that all of these factors impact it. So then we have to decipher which one is more important, or which one is affecting my nervous system, which is affecting my health more than others. We don't know. It's very difficult. And this is, again, as we start to go into silos, is that you have individuals that purely think that nutrition is the way that health has to be optimized. You have to eat ketogenic, you have to eat vegan, you have to eat this, and this is the way, and this is the way that it is. And so it's a piece of the pie. For each individual, it's going to be different. It could be a big piece of the pie, it could be a little piece of the pie, it could be the best diet form, the worst diet form. It's really hard to be able to understand. But I think heart rate variability is a great reflector of that. So overall, it's a phenomenal whole health biomarker. It's great. It's just the actionability, if people don't have this whole health mindset, is very minimal. And this is where I run into a lot of problems with companies that I consult with, is the fact that they'll have a medical practice that want to utilize this, all medical doctors. Well, how do we improve? We have no success in improving heart rate variability with people. Absolutely. Because you're missing gigantic pieces of what is health. You have your idea, which is the blood work component of it all. Phenomenal. Great. There's so much more to health than someone's biochemistry. So how do we assess all of those areas and figure out of that? And this is where, again, we have to integrate different people from different backgrounds to truly impact health. And we're getting around it a little bit more of understanding that it isn't impactful, but I cannot say that the fact that exercise for everyone is the most important thing. I cannot say that nutrition, I cannot say areas. We know that social health is super important with connections and relationships. Absolutely. And the Surgeon General just came out with a report that showed all of the impact that social health has on individuals. And I say that's just as important as exercise, as diet, as emotional regulation in all these areas. I absolutely, completely agree. And I think this is where we have to look at health this way, that we have to have different areas and different people start to be able to consult to figure out from an individual perspective, where do we need to focus? We can't just focus on one, and we can't just have this, cookie cutter type of approach with individuals. Is that we need a whole health approach for each individual that it comprises all areas, so we can truly, really impact health span and longevity.
One of the many paradoxes of life, the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. If you were to summarize your definition of health in like a short summary, 1 or 2 sentences, what does health mean to Greg?
Ooh, that's a very good question, because we can go through the definition of health, right?
Based on your life experience, your professional experience, the totality of all of your exposure thus far. Yes.
To me, it's about feeling physically capable, mentally capable, and socially capable to live the life that you want to be able to live. Individual. Every people have different expectations as to what each of those are, but it's about having all those kind of components from a health perspective. And those comprise, this is very broad because those comprise of many different areas, right? You got to have a certain amount of purpose and drive. You have to have a lot of self-acceptance and, interoception and emotional regulation, all these different areas that can comprise this. But you have to have your physical capability, your emotional capability, and your social capability to live the life that you see yourself living. Because again, one of the things is you and I may have a different outlook of how we want to live our life down the road, right? I may just want to be sitting on the beach and having Mai Tais when I'm 80. You maybe want to be able to climb every mountain that you possibly can at that specific time, right? We have different outlooks, we have different purposes, we have different ideas of how we want to be able to live our life. But as long as we have the physical capability to do it, the emotional capability to do it and the social capabilities to do it, I think we're doing pretty good.
I think this is a really interesting definition of health. Would you encourage someone who maybe doesn't have ambitions to climb Mount Everest when they're 80 to push the envelope? Say they are, they are satisfied with the idea at 50, 60, 70, 80 years old. There's no real ambition to be overly active, to be, cognitively as they were maybe at 30 years old. Would you still suggest, though, that it's important that there's an ambition there that kind of gets them to go that extra mile? And if so, why? And the reason I ask this question is we met at a longevity summit, right? So there's a passion there for longevity. And so within this frame of health, maybe not everyone wants to know how to live to 150 or how to climb mountains at 80 years old.
Yeah, you got to meet them where they're at, right? And so when I'm helping people that are purely in those later stages, into their 40s, their 50s, their 60s, one of the questions I always ask is, what do you see yourself doing when you're 70, when you're 80, when you're 90, these different stages to start to realize okay, are we on the right track to be able to get there? Peter Attia said this in his book, which is phenomenal, is that if your goal is to be here at this point, where are we at now to be able to meet those goals? We know with aging, it's one of those natural processes we can mitigate as much as we possibly can. But to me, I'm not going to treat everybody to the fact that you have to be running a marathon at 80, right? If you want to just be able to walk up to the block and back and forth at 80, then that's phenomenal. What can we do to make sure that you maintain that? You want to be able to have strong relationships with your family, right? That may be distant right now. You want to be able to build that up. What can we possibly do to be able to achieve the closest that you so longly, because that's another big problem is you talk about the loneliness factor of aging individuals. That's a gigantic component into that in someone's health. And even my own story with my grandmother, who was the matriarch of the family and a very strong Irish woman that was a nurse. And, I went away to school for 8 years, and to see her decline every year that I came back, right, playing the sport, to be able to see that, coming back from the US or out east, to see her physical decline as she started to be able to age was very hard for me because she wanted to be able to achieve certain things and she loved walking and do that type of stuff. And see her physical decline as she started to not take care of herself, became more lonely, started going to an assisted living home, not seeing us as often. That played a gigantic component into her decline and eventual passing. I really think that individuals shouldn't be pushing to everyone has to have this absolute physical peak where they need to be living to 150. That's not the goal. The goal is to be able to live a meaningful life and to achieve what you want to be able to achieve. And so understanding that from an individual perspective, which is great. If people want their whole point of health is to be laughing with friends until they literally are on their deathbed, then let's see what we can do to be able to achieve that. That's the goal.
I really resonate with this because it was ultimately the realization. You mentioned a couple of tracks and themes, one being identity, which I really agree with. How do we break up with an identity of the person that's sick and in pain and recreate ourselves? And this idea that we need to use the sense of the evolutionary pull towards the life that we want to be able to live rather than pushing against something in order to achieve optimal health. And, in the end, what really was the catalyst for me when I realized I didn't want my life to be a series of doctor's appointments anymore. I didn't want to be near death in my teenage years. I wanted to thrive. Really, the reason I wanted to do that is I felt like there were things that I really wanted to accomplish in this life. And I was confronted with this ultimatum that I was actually going to have to choose. I was going to have to choose the eating disorder, or I was going to have to choose the things that brought me, the most purpose that I felt called to do in the world. And I think that principle, that connection to purpose, is actually a massively unknown, unspoken about contribution to the conversation of health. When you are in relationship with something that's bigger than you, something that drives you, a vision for your life, I really have personally experienced and seen in others I've worked with this superhuman ability to not only heal, but to overcome, significant challenges in health and also in other areas of life.
No, it's the one age group that I see this significant in is people that are recently retired, right? So I work with a few people that are in Canada at 65. So they're kind of that 63, 65, they've retired, they've done it for a couple of years and they think everything is fine and dandy. And they start talking about purpose of, what they want to be able to achieve, what they want to be able to do, how they want to be able to live their life a little bit more. And again, getting more to the root cause of, what is their purpose now that they're in this stage. And a lot of them can't answer the question. They just either get into their routines, they do that type of stuff, and then life passes them by into what's going on, right? And, 20, 30 years, all of a sudden, they're in their 70s or 80s, and they've, not wasted, but they weren't fulfilled by their remaining years of their life. And it's interesting to do some objective markers on those individuals where even coming with a better identity and a better purpose of how that actually improves things that you want to be able to improve, whether it's heart variability. I remember one individual we have, he was not sleeping. It was very disrupted sleep as a part of what's going on. And we literally started to sit down and talk about purpose and building that habit and identity. And he goes, well, I'm sleeping 6 to 7 to 8 hours in a row now. And I never did that over the last few years. Right. And so it's just to be able to see the impact that it has, because he may have been trying to I need melatonin, or I need a darker room, or all these different areas about sleep hygiene. This is where, again, you can't focus on these silos, because you can have a sleep expert that makes it absolutely identical and people are still waking up. And it's due to the root cause that they've lost their identity as an individual, as a successful entrepreneur, right? And they're in the next stage of life, and they're trying to be able to figure that out. And it's something that they need to be aware of, be able to root out, and then to be able to reflect that of how that can impact health and well-being for individuals going forward.
Such an important message. Truth is, it has chosen heart rate variability as the key indicator to measure emotional state, which, along the way, we've looked at many different biomarkers. I've had many people tell me that it's not possible, and we're now making it possible with the machine learning model we're building. That's even, on another level, helped me understand, wow, hey, heart rate variability really is this biomarker that has such a deep indication. And when it's directed, as we're doing with the machine learning model, you can get granular and actually start to look at the different components of someone's health, which is incredible. Our interest is emotional state. And I know one of the first conversations you and I connected on was these examples, these case studies where you've had clients where you've really looked at the holistic or the seemingly holistic picture, and there still hasn't been an improvement. And part of that missing piece might be, most likely is, their emotional state. I'd love you to just share your wisdom on that.
Yeah, and this is where, again, it was very much rooted into, individuals, osteopathies. It sees a lot of people that are in the chronic pain, chronic conditions state, very, that type of symptomology, whether it's fatigue. So it's a lot of symptom management individuals. And so what we're taught is in our realm of things is there's big three things you can impact. You can impact sleep, impact nutrition, impact physical activity, right? And then everything's rooted as stress management past that point, right? Stress management as a general thing, which talks about all the complexities around the psychosocial aspects of an individual. And as I got really into the weeds of looking about chronic pain and chronic fatigue in particular, you start to realize how there's so many more factors that can impact someone's pain and their overall conditions that comprise kind of the biopsychosocial model. And when people come to me, the difficulty is the fact that they're looking for something from a physical nature. They're looking for an exercise or a technique that I can provide to them, or alterations of their sleep, or there's some sort of the things that fit into the biological health that fits a lot more into those areas. That was what they're looking for. And it was hard for me to have conversations around, there's so many more aspects that are part of your recovery, that are part of your care, that we need to be able to move forward with without them really feeling judged, honestly. It's, people don't make the connections. I had this individual not too long ago that came in, and she's coming to me for lower back pain. She's had a herniated disc for a long period of time, but it's been debilitating for the last few months. And it was really hard for her to make the connection that going through divorce, having a very high stress job, had to recently put in a restraining order on her husband because he was, I can't see some of the things, but a lot of bad stuff on the back end of things, how this could impact her pain because she was looking for some sort of manipulation or manual therapy stretch to take it away. And so without saying, for me, it's to really open up that conversation with the individual. How can I best do that to open those things? And that's where, these kind of holistic health assessments are super impactful to data around people of saying, hey, there's certain areas of our health and well-being that you're not addressing. And how can we help facilitate that? And my hope is to recommend, obviously, companies like yours of saying, let's start to work on that aspect and use HRV as our marker of going forward, integrate with all these wearables as well. to start working on to the emotional state of an individual and how that can just absolutely impact my ability to help them with what I'm at, right, with my silo. But I'm not naive to it, which is a big step for a lot of practitioners these days. Even to the point, with, again, the thought leader around the space right now with health and longevity, he talks about his big 5 things that he helps people with. He goes, again, sleep. He goes physical activity. He goes nutrition. He goes drugs. And then he goes emotional health. And just incorporates that all into one, though, right? I'm like, okay, I don't think he's necessary. It's great that he's starting to talk about it. I think it's great that the understanding of how our emotional health is as a part of that point. But I think he did a disservice as to its impact that we could possibly have. And again, it's his background as a medical doctor, but I don't think people are really realizing from the health space how much emotional health, social health plays into our overall health and well-being. I think it's being very much underplayed, undervalued into what's going on. And I think once we all work together with all these different components to start to be able to figure out how all these are intertwined, I think we can make absolutely huge strides in regards to the prevention of diseases and increase of health span.
Yes, which is such a shared vision. And I really think that, not so distant future, we're going to look back and think it was totally, barbaric that we did any kind of invasive surgery because we're going to have these alternatives. I think being able to measure and understand the coherence of the body, use things like frequency, are really going to start to overtake some of the existing Western discipline of medicine, which I'm really excited about. What's your view on, let's say, the next 30 years of health?
Again, you're right on it to the point that I think there's a lot of barbaric ways that we were viewing health and how to best help it. I remember reading some of the stuff around the early diabetes prevention stuff in the 60s, and it's almost malpractice if people started doing those things now into what's going on. And so
have that dentistry.
Yeah, it's just we shifted so far. We're starting to be able to shift back. And I think, there's a lot of these surgeries and interventions that aren't necessary. I mean, the examples that I can have with these crazy interventions that were done medically without a true diagnosis, what they would inject, what they would remove, what they would do, all these things, start to realize, like, one of the things in my profession that is quite predominant is used to hear all the time is with athletes is that they would get their knee scoped or cleaned up. Right. Their meniscus that they have, it's the shock absorber of the knee. They get it cleaned up, they get it shaved off, and they'll be like, okay, well, that's great. There's no pain anymore. Phenomenal. What we've come to realize is the fact that these people had a significantly high propensity to osteoarthritis and knee replacements later in life. Right. In the moment, it was great. But to a degree, there was no difference in regards to outcome than versus a physical therapy than this medical intervention. But the propensity of having to have further surgery or further interventions were significantly minimalized if you went the more conservative route. And I think we're starting to realize that that's a gigantic piece that these quote unquote alternative therapies that are out there with the newer ways of measuring health, understanding health, and understanding function and quality of life. I think a lot of these things will start to make their way into the Western medicine side of things to truly get people to not have these drastic, interventions that are traumatic interventions. Is one thing that we always say to individuals is people have a surgery, whether it's small, whether it's a root canal, whether it's something really small. And they kind of go, well, why is this, being such a bother to me, and how this can manifest in bigger problems? Like it's a trauma. And just because it's small doesn't necessarily mean that it wasn't impactful for you. Right. It's a traumatic experience, and it's a big deal for the body to be able to deal with. And getting away from that stuff is the way that it should be. I think science is catching up to understanding that's the way it should be done.
It's super exciting. Such a great conversation. I really trust and hope that everyone has, listened, that felt inspired to take some action, to start to look at Rate Variability, to start to evaluate the holistic nature of your life, and ask yourself those really sometimes very difficult questions. Do you have balance, happiness, fulfillment in all areas of life? And look at the implication of that on your longevity. Greg, how can our listeners that want to learn more about you and your work engage?
Yeah, one of the things that I've started in the last little while is a company called HealthQb. What we're trying to be able to do is we're trying to point people in the right direction. We're trying to tell people, is there certain lifestyle factors that are not being addressed and how to best address those, and point people and saying, hey, these are the areas. which again, within truth, is going to be phenomenal. That we'll pull people in that direction. And so it's one area is check us out there, yourhealthqb.com. And any questions that you have from us, you can email me. It's greg@yourhealthqb.com. Right now, we're just launching some integrations into some of the wearables, which is we want to be device agnostic, condition or goal agnostic to a degree. So we can start to highlight some of these phenomenal companies and be a little bit of a triage for individuals of saying, hey, here are some areas of your health and here's some phenomenal companies that are doing unbelievable work in these areas. So that's one way. And then if you're ever in the Vancouver, Canada area, I have a clinic in downtown Vancouver. It's called Fit to Train down there with some phenomenal therapists. We've osteopaths and physios and naturopaths. And we really try to encompass this, not multidisciplinary clinic, but an interdisciplinary clinic where we really work as a team to solve these more complex conditions that are out there. And so I always tell people when they walk in the door, it's rarely that you only be seeing me because I have a certain skill set, certain ways to be able to address your health, but we have a team around to making sure that we're covering all areas from there. So those are the two ways that you can get in touch with me.
Thank you. And last words of hope, maybe to someone listening that is on a health journey.
Yeah, it's the biggest thing we talked about is you have a safe amount of agency. And I think that's been such a strong and phenomenal message these last, 5-10 years of understanding that you do actually have a significant amount of control over your health. When you're diagnosed with a certain condition and you're given some certain label that is given to you from a medical professional, it's not your identity. It's not who you are. You have a lot to be able to offer the world and yourself. And you have a significant amount of control to be able to overcome this, live a high quality life. And that it does take work. It does take a little bit of self-discovery. It takes a lot of vulnerability and testing, but there are significant amount of advances that you can make into your health and well-being just by you. And so don't let the diagnosis become your identity.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Greg.
Nicole, this is a pleasure. And I just want to say what you're doing is absolute phenomenal work. And I'm so excited the fact that we were able to connect because this is an area of me, and I express this to you that, I'm lacking knowledge in, but I can't wait to be able to grow in these areas and to help individuals here to get a better understanding of what, emotional regulation and love and connection can do for individuals. So I'm excited what your community is doing, and I can't wait to be able to work further and grow this message that you guys are trying to be able to spread.
This is just the beginning, and know that if you're excited about this collaboration, I am keeping a log and documenting all of the work that Greg and I are doing together as I evaluate these areas of my health and put myself through the process so I can meaningfully share it with everyone in the Love Out Loud community. And hopefully, beyond, Greg, would love to have you in our community think tank where the community have an opportunity to ask you questions. If you haven't joined our think tank yet, please do so. We'll put the link in the show notes along with all of Greg's links. And, this is information that we're passionate about giving to people in an accessible way. Every single person's birthright, as far as we're concerned, is inclusive of that sense of agency, that sense of free will in their own life, especially as it applies to your health and longevity. So thank you, Greg.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening, my friend. If you enjoyed the show, please let us know by leaving a review or sharing the episode with someone you love and expanding this conversation as far and wide as possible. If you're looking for a community to have conversations with about global affairs, please jump in our Telegram group or join our free think tanks. Thanks for being a part of the shift towards a love-based civilization. We'll see you in the Telegram group or in the next episode.